buying time to load the PowerPoint, so sorry for boring you with my background, but it does work in terms of buying time. I wanted to start today with an examination of what's happening internationally to give a strategic context to why we have information access laws and to examine how they actually complement other aspects of our legal system and, in fact, our cultural and social system to really build trust in government and to provide a more cohesive, representative, democratic system of government. So from that sort of international strategic perspective, I want to then look at what's happening nationally and how Australia is now looking at advancing open government and the open government agenda, then drill down into the states and really the performance of states under their different legislative regimes, and then come back to New South Wales and look at how we're performing in that context. So I have a few slides to take you through some of those issues. This one, I think you'll probably be very alive to the Edelman Trust Barometer. Are people familiar with that measure that's been really published for the last 10 years, looking at 28 countries across trust in 4 institutions, NGOs, media, government and businesses. So this slide is trust in government, obviously to set the context for our discussion today. You'll be very interested to see the states at the lowest drop ever at minus 14% in trust in government. Now overall they hit the high watermark or low watermark in terms of a deficit of trust, with a drop of 9% across all 4 institutions for this year from 2017 to 2018. Australia is one of the countries continuing on that downward trajectory. So the year before, Australia had dropped by 5 points, this year by 2 points, cumulative total obviously 7 points over 2 years. That's a significant trust deficit, I think, that's being measured in Australia. So what are the trust drivers? How do we drive trust, and what does trust achieve? Trust is part of the answer. It's a dimension. It's not the entire answer. And likewise, information access is part of the answer as well. So the OGP looked at which is the Open Government Partnership. There are 78 countries who are signatories to the Open Government Partnership. It commenced in 2011. And I'll come to Australia's now being a signature to that in a moment. But it's based on the principles of promoting transparency, accountability, innovation and technology, and public participation. So in the last couple of weeks, the OGP has released a series of occasional papers looking at what are the trust drivers, why do we have this deficit in trust, and how does it impact democratic systems. Now, some of those papers that I've been reading through come to really recognising that there's 3 fundamental features that collectively work in harmony to inspire trust and to promote democratic representative systems of government. And they're summarised, I think, as transparency, participation and responsiveness. So information access laws sit in the transparency quadrant. Those articles also recognise the cultural dimensions, so that trust is a manifestation not only of laws, but practices, of resources, and of the institutions that operate to govern those countries. So I want to just take you to some results that look at what are the cultural attitudes to information access in New South Wales. So the cultural attitudes in New South Wales, we've measured for the last 2 years. We measured in 2014 and again in 2016. And we measured it against an awareness of the right to access information. And as you can see, we had a 5 percentage point increase from 2014 to 2016. I'd like to say the IPC is solely responsible for that, but I think some of the factors that we saw on Maureen's graph, there are events that lead to a heightened awareness. And they can be very positive or very controversial events. Some of the more positive events that are taking place in New South Wales actually go to open data. And the legislation that has been introduced in New South Wales to actually open up data sets. So those features have impacted community awareness, but that's a very high level of awareness of the right to access information in New South Wales. We also asked the question in 2014 and 16, when you sought to access information, did you know that it was held by these sectors? You can see that there has been an increased response. Now that's the IPC's jurisdiction. Local councils, state government departments, state-owned corporations, universities and ministers and their staff. Some people are always very surprised to see that last column. So from that setting, I want to take you back to the national setting about the Open Government Partnership and what we're doing there. Has everyone heard of the Open Government Partnership and Australia signing up to that? It's about 3 years in development and finally a signature in 2016. The Open Government Partnership is based upon promotion of accountability, as I said, technology and innovation, citizen participation and transparency. So what's most important about the OGP is that countries sign up to action plans. Those action plans are evaluated. Are they going to deliver against those principles? What tangible outcomes can we measure? Not only are they independently reviewed to see if they're worthy of submission and thereby gain entry to the partnership, but they're also reviewed by independent reviewers throughout the life of the action plan to see if it actually achieved what it set out to achieve. We're currently going through that phase now with Australia's first National Action Plan, and we're also in the phase of developing the second National Action Plan. So in the first National Action Plan, I led a piece of work on behalf of all state and territory information commissioners and ombudsmen, and we contributed to those ambitions. We contributed under the information access ambition, and we determined to provide a lens through which citizens could look at the outcomes of their information access legislative regimes. So we all know, and the World Justice Project has highlighted, that it doesn't matter how good your legislative framework looks like, it's how it's operationalised that actually enlivens the right to information access. So all of our states and territories have very different information access legislative regimes. We recognise that as information commissioners, and not only did we produce this report, this metrics, but we also produced a compendium that you can access to look at the different features of the legislation through all of the states and territories. So we've taken this forward, and it will continue to be a feature. We consulted a lot. We looked at the metrics that had been established internationally by organisations like the World Justice Project, Right to Know, and a couple of other internationally recognised measures. And we came up with the primary measures that you can see here around what's the response to formal applications, the number of applications per capita, so application by type, and I think Maureen talked about the two categories. We have some more refined categories, but essentially most jurisdictions have two categories. Applications rates per capita, reviews as a percentage of applications that have been decided, so it's the appeal rate, release rates and refusal rates, to give us a measure. New South Wales is very interesting. I'm just going to pick a low-hanging one so I can point to that. But if we look at the percentage of decisions, top for you, the right-hand quadrant there, New South Wales only receives 1.9 applications per 1,000 population. Now, we speculate, again, this is a lens to give policymakers some insight. This is not something with rigorous, we have not tested some of our hypotheses against other research. So New South Wales, relatively low. So too Queensland, relatively low, particularly compared to Victoria and South Australia, Western Australia. Commonwealth's also quite low. We're speculating that the reason for New South Wales and Queensland being lower is because we have what's known as a Tranche 2 piece of legislation. Tranche 1 is enshrining the right to apply for information access. Tranche 2 is pushing it out there, proactive release, mandatory proactive release, authorised proactive release. So in jurisdictions where you have that push model, we hypothesise that there may well be less formal applications made. Likewise, in the New South Wales jurisdiction, it's possible to translate a formal application to an informal application and it wouldn't be captured. But the release rates are also very interesting, and based on that, is it that what can be released proactively is resulting in some decisions that might go to either exclusions or cabinet in confidence, legal professional privilege? Are these some of the features that we're seeing for a refusal to grant information access? So building on the work that Maureen's done in relation to the privacy or personal information feature. If I take you from those states and territories quickly into New South Wales and the latest Section 37 report, I'm required under the Act to produce a report every year on how the Act's operating generally across all sectors. So that includes the university sector, the local council sector, ministers and their crown. So this is, and their staff. So this is aggregate data. Some of the interesting features for this year's report are that we have had a 20% increase in applications for non-personal information. So that's a very interesting dimension. We have, very pleasingly in my view, an increase in our release rates. We've gone up by 3%. That's on the back of New South Wales sliding in terms of release rates and declining. And that might be as a response to the type of application or the type of information sought, but remember we're dealing with aggregate data. So we worked very hard last year to try and work with agencies to look at what information should be released, what information might fall into the other category, for example, which through some additional steps might actually become released information. So we went up by 3% there. Statutory timeframes have decreased, and largely that seems to be, and it may well be related to a 20% increase in applications for non-personal information that require further consultation and that require retrieval of records. And we think with the cluster arrangements where retrieval of records is quite difficult for agencies, that a negotiation to extend the timeframes is something that may well be a feature of our jurisdiction right now. So there's some of the more interesting outcomes. The most interesting, I think, to support everything that this panel's going to say and the reason why you're here, is that over the last 2 years, formal applications have gone up by 20%. That's really very, very significant. 15% last year, 5% this year. So I think the interest in information access is clearly demonstrated by those sort of statistics. Now, transparency. I started with transparency and I'm finishing with transparency. This year we will release a public-facing dashboard. It will be available to any member of the public and will be available to agencies using their data. That dashboard will collect up those 8 key measures that you just saw from the Section 37 report, use Tableau as a data visualisation tool to enable people to consider outcomes by sector. Now, within sectors, there can be a variety of change, but as I continue to stress, this is aggregate data. So this will enable both agencies to look at their own performance, to predict application volumes, to better apply resources, to consider themselves against sector averages, not benchmarks, and in that way also consult with peers. Look at how people are achieving different outcomes and in some instances better outcomes, and to use that to improve their performance to the degree that that is possible within existing systems, because I think one of the issues we know we're facing are the IT systems at a state government level. Local councils have completely different issues that they have to deal with, and that general statement would not necessarily be as applicable to them in some instances. So this transparency is to promote awareness, visibility, very, very importantly, to promote the role of principal officers who are responsible under the GIPA Act for the conduct of managing information access applications, to give them visibility, because this sort of data may well not come to their attention. It is the sort of data that you might see at a risk and audit committee, and that's the right home for it, to galvanise executive and strategic thinking. And it's also an opportunity for citizens to look at how applications are being managed in New South Wales. So for us, this is a tool that meets the dual and hopefully complementary purposes of transparency for both those charged with responsibility for the GIPA Act, but also for citizens.